My mother smiled at a donor, pointed to my grandfather and said, "That's our rustic origin." Then she turned to me, her voice like ice. "Oprah, please stop standing like a soldier. You're ruining the picture." She had no idea I didn't come here to pose. I came to tear that picture apart. My name is Oprah Crane. I am 29 years old. I stepped into the great stair hall of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the air hit me like a physical thing, thick and heavy with the commingled scents of expensive perfume, catered canapes, and a particular kind of self-congratulation I'd come to recognize as the signature fragrance of my family's world. Murmurs and brittle laughter echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings, bouncing between the priceless tapestries and the marble statues. Men in bespoke suits and women in shimmering gowns drifted through the hall like elegant, predatory fish in a well-lit aquarium. This wasn't a party, it was a performance. My mother, Genevieve Crane, materialized from the crowd, a vision in an emerald silk dress that whispered against the stone floor as she moved. "Oprah, you made it," she said, her smile a perfect, polished curve that never once touched the cool assessment in her eyes. She gave my simple, dark gray suit a glance that was as swift as it was dismissive. "Do try to mingle, darling, and please don't stand at attention like you're on parade. You ruin the composition." She didn't wait for a reply, simply glided away, leaving a wake of chilled air behind her. Across the hall, my father, Harrison Crane, was holding court with a Pennsylvania state senator. He saw me, and his eyes flickered with a brief, almost imperceptible moment of recognition, before he gave me a short, sharp nod. It was the same nod he gave the valet who parked his car or the waiter who refilled his water glass. An acknowledgement of service, not of kinship. My brother Spencer, the self-anointed brand strategist, was a few feet away, pontificating to a cluster of young, adoring women about leveraging brand synergy in the nonprofit space. He was selling them air, and they were buying it by the gallon. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I did not belong here. I was a foreign object, a miscalculation in their carefully curated world. My posture was too straight, my gaze too direct, my tolerance for insincerity worn down to nothing by years of service. I was here for one reason and one reason only: my grandfather. As a United States Army officer, a graduate of West Point, I was trained to identify and confront the enemy. I had just never been taught that the most dangerous enemy, the one you could never truly turn your back on, sometimes shares your last name. I finally spotted him. My grandfather, Silas Croft, was seated at a small solitary table, tucked away behind a towering abstract sculpture of twisted steel. He looked small and out of place in his best suit, a decade old but impeccably clean and pressed, a sturdy oak tree in a forest of decorative plastic. And then I saw it. Propped on the white linen tablecloth in front of him was a small, transparent acrylic plaque. The words, precisely etched by a laser, seemed to burn into my retinas. Silas Croft, Rustic Origins, Rustic Origins. The words weren't a tribute, they were a label, a classification. It was the kind of intellectual dismissive cruelty my mother specialized in. She had turned my grandfather, the man who taught me the meaning of honor, into an exhibit. A quaint artifact from her past, put on display to highlight how far she had come. My stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. Just then, I saw my mother gesturing toward him as she spoke to a severe-looking art critic from New York. "That's my father," I heard her say, her voice carrying across the polished floor. "A simple carpenter. We've come a long, long way, haven't we?" They shared a laugh, a dry, sophisticated sound that dripped with condescension. It was a joke, and my grandfather was the punchline. I turned my gaze back to him. He hadn't heard them, or perhaps he had chosen not to. I watched as he quietly, deliberately, reached out with a hand gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of working with wood. A hand that had built, repaired, and created. He didn't smash the sign or protest. He simply took it. And with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any shout, he turned it face down on the table. That single silent act of accepting the insult, of absorbing it without complaint, was more devastating than 1,000 angry words. It felt like a fist closing around my heart, squeezing the air from my lungs. In the sudden, ringing silence of my mind, the West Point Honor Code echoed, as clear as a bugle call at dawn. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. Or tolerate those who do. I could not tolerate this, not for one more second. The fury that had been building inside me didn't explode into a scream. It solidified. It froze into a single, clear objective. I began to move, my steps measured and purposeful. I walked over to the coat check, retrieved the old, worn cardigan I'd helped him put on earlier, and returned to his side. I gently draped the soft wool over his shoulders. "We're going home, Grandpa," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and sharp enough to cut through the nearby chatter. My mother spun around, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Oprah, what in the world do you think you're doing? Don't you dare make a scene." I looked directly into her eyes. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at her as a daughter seeking approval, but as an adversary on a battlefield. I saw past the silk dress and the perfect hair to the cold, calculating strategist beneath. "I'm not making a scene," I replied, my voice as steady and cold as steel. "I'm escorting a man of honor out of this place." I helped him to his feet. He leaned on me slightly, and together we turned and walked away. We walked past the senator, past the art critics, past my stunned brother. We walked out of the grand hall, leaving the entire glittering false picture of their lives to begin cracking and splintering under the weight of its own hypocrisy. The engine of my grandfather's old Ford pickup truck rumbled softly as we crossed the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, leaving the glittering, indifferent skyline of Center City behind us. The bright lights of the museum faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the warm, familiar glow of the streetlights illuminating the brick row houses of Fishtown. The silence inside the cab was a heavy blanket, thick with everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. Finally, as we turned onto his street, Silas spoke, his voice raspy with an emotion he rarely showed. "They're ashamed of me, Oprah," he said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Ashamed of these hands, of the old workshop." He took a breath, a ragged, heavy sound. "I can take it, but I can't stand the way they look at you because of it, the way they make you feel." He paused, and then he delivered the line that fractured something deep inside me. "I don't care what they think of me. I only care what you think of me." His words didn't just hurt, they unlocked a door to a room filled with memories I had kept packed away, each one a piece of the same painful pattern. I realized in that moment that tonight wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the latest entry on a map of scars they had been carving onto me and onto this good man for years. My anger from the museum was no longer a hot, searing flame. It cooled, coalescing into something methodical and cold, something with a purpose. The memories began to surface, unbidden. Thanksgiving 2 years ago. I had been stateside for less than a week, just back from a grueling deployment in Afghanistan. I was 10 pounds lighter, my skin still kissed by a sun on the other side of the world, a faint ringing still echoing in my ears from a roadside bomb that had gone off too close to our convoy. The whole family was gathered around my mother's mahogany dining table, which was groaning under the weight of a perfectly roasted turkey, glistening cranberry sauce, and at least a dozen side dishes. Spencer was holding court, his voice booming with enthusiasm as he described a new marketing campaign for some organic, gluten-free vodka. My parents listened, rapt, their faces glowing with pride. "Now that's the real battlefield, son, brand building," my father declared, raising his wine glass in a toast. "That's where the real wars are won." Not a single person asked me about my war. Not one question about the dust, the fear, the bone-deep weariness, or the faces of the soldiers who served beside me. When I finally found a small opening and tried to share a simple story about the camaraderie, about how my platoon had adopted a stray dog we'd named Sergeant Scraps, my mother cut me off mid-sentence. "Oprah, please," she said with a tight, dismissive smile. "Let's not talk about war at the dinner table. It gives people indigestion." Just like that, I became invisible. A ghost in combat boots, sitting at my own family's Thanksgiving table. They passed the mashed potatoes around me as if I weren't there, celebrating victories in a world of branding and profit margins. A world I didn't understand and had no desire to join. The first memory triggered another. A year before that Thanksgiving, I'd come home on a short leave to find the roof of my grandfather's workshop leaking badly after a storm. I used the money I'd painstakingly saved from my officer's salary, money I'd earmarked for a down payment on a small condo, to have it repaired. When my father found out, he summoned me to his study. It was a room designed to intimidate, all mahogany, worn leather, and the smell of old money. "Oprah," he began, not looking at me, but at the flickering stock ticker on his widescreen monitor. "I paid for a West Point education. That was an investment in a powerful network, in a certain future." He finally turned his cold eyes on me. "And what do you do with it? You squander your capital on carpenters? You are devaluing yourself. You are becoming a poorly performing asset." He didn't see a daughter who loved her grandfather. He saw a stock that was trending downward, an investment that had failed to yield the expected returns. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were so devoid of any recognizable human emotion. They revealed the stark, transactional nature of his view of the world, and my place in it. Later that night, I was staying in the small guest room at my grandfather's house. I couldn't sleep. I walked into his living room and saw my West Point graduation picture hanging in the place of honor above his simple fireplace. He had framed it himself, the wood a dark, rich cherry that he'd polished to a soft gleam. He was so proud. My father saw a failing investment. My grandfather saw his whole world. Standing there in the quiet house, the scent of sawdust and wood oil a comforting presence, I thought of a line from General Douglas MacArthur's farewell address to the cadets at West Point, a speech we had been required to memorize. "Yours is the profession of arms, the will to win, the sure knowledge that in war there is no substitute for victory." My father was right about one thing. This was a war. He had just mistaken the battlefield. And as I stared at my own determined face in that photograph, I made a silent vow. In this war, my war, there would be no substitute for victory. The sun was barely climbing over the rooftops of Fishtown the next morning. but I didn't allow myself the luxury of wallowing in emotion. The cold resolve that had settled in my heart the night before had a name. It was a mission. And missions required action, not contemplation. I sat at my grandfather's simple kitchen table, my laptop open, and initiated 2 video calls over an encrypted channel. There was no room for error, no space for leaks. My first call was to a face I'd trusted since our first year at West Point, Major David Chen, JAG Corps. His mind was a legal razor blade, honed by years of navigating the labyrinth of military law. When his face appeared on the screen, sharp and alert even at this early hour, I got straight to the point. Dave, I need you to look into the charter and financial records of a nonprofit foundation, I said, my voice low and even, extremely discreetly. Consider it done, he replied, no hesitation. He didn't ask why, he didn't need to. My second call was to Commander Eva Rostova. We had served 2 tours together in Iraq, sharing stale MREs in the back of a Humvee while analyzing intelligence that meant the difference between life and death. If anyone could follow a money trail through the dark, she could. Ava, I said, the moment her face, framed by dark, serious hair, came into focus. I need a full financial workup, cash flow, expenditures, vendor contracts, everything you can find on the Crane Endowment for Artisans. Give me 48 hours, she said, her eyes already distant, her analyst's mind likely building the search parameters. That was it. No questions, no doubts. In our world, a request from a trusted comrade was a command. This was my real family, my chosen family. A family forged not by blood and social contracts, but by shared risk, unwavering loyalty, and the kind of trust that is earned under fire, not signed over in a boardroom. It was a foundation built on rock, not the shifting sands of my parents' ambition. Later that day, feeling the first stirrings of a concrete plan, I sat down with my grandfather in his workshop. The air smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, a scent that had always meant safety and truth to me. I told him what I had set in motion. I told him I was going to challenge my parents for control of the endowment. He was silent for a long time, his gaze lost somewhere in the grain of the workbench he was sanding. Finally, he wiped his hands on a rag, sighed a breath that seemed to carry the weight of decades, and walked into the small back room he used as an office. He returned a moment later, carrying an old, hand-carved wooden box. He placed it on the bench between us. "They're going to use this against you, Oprah," he said, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He opened the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a sheaf of yellowed documents, bound by a brittle rubber band. It was an agreement, signed and notarized 15 years ago. My grandmother, Martha, had been in the final stages of her battle with cancer. The insurance had run out, and the medical bills were piling up into a mountain of debt that threatened to swallow him whole. To save his wife, to give her the best care possible in her final days, Silas had signed a covenant. He had willingly, legally, transferred controlling interest of the endowment, his life's work, his legacy, to Genevieve and Harrison. In return, they had agreed to pay every last medical bill, no matter the cost. "I sold my legacy," he confessed, his voice cracking for the first time. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "I sold it for 6 more months with the love of my life." My heart didn't just break, it felt like it had been ripped from my chest. My neat, clean, righteous war had just become a messy, complicated quagmire. I wasn't just fighting for his honor anymore. I was fighting against his own signature, against an impossible choice born of absolute love and utter desperation. My mother's first line of attack was now clear. She wouldn't have to lie. She would tell the truth, her truth. A basic tactical lesson from my training echoed in my mind. No plan survives contact with the enemy. I had just made contact, not with my parents, but with the complex, painful truth of the past. The initial shock subsided, replaced by a cold, new clarity. My mother would spin this. She would paint me as the ungrateful, belligerent daughter, trampling on a sacred promise her own grandfather had made. She would portray him as a victim they had magnanimously rescued. But I saw a different picture. They didn't rescue him. They used his darkest moment as leverage. They saw his grief as a business opportunity. They had turned an act of love into a hostile takeover. I reached out and placed my hand over his on top of the yellowed documents. His hand was trembling slightly. Mine was steady. "No, Grandpa," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You didn't sell your legacy. You traded it to save Grandma. You made a choice any good man would have made." I looked him straight in the eye, willing him to see the conviction in mine. "Now I'm going to get it back, not just for you or for Grandma's memory. I'm getting it back for every artist this endowment was created to help." My objective hadn't just changed, it had grown. This was bigger than the Crane family. This was about justice. The call came after midnight, jarring me from a restless sleep. It was David Chen. His voice was sharp, stripped of all pleasantries. "Oprah, I found it. They're sloppy, arrogant and sloppy." I sat up in bed, instantly wide awake. "Talk to me, Dave." "Your mother has been paying herself a curation fee of $50,000 a year for exhibits that, as far as I can tell, never happened. There are no records, no rental agreements, no transport manifests. The money just vanishes into a private consulting LLC under her maiden name." He continued, the words coming fast. "And your father has awarded over $250,000 in no-bid renovation contracts for endowment properties to a construction firm owned by his primary golf partner. The work was either never done or billed at 5 times the market rate." It was exactly what I suspected, but hearing it confirmed sent a grim satisfaction through me. But David wasn't done. "The real prize, though, is your brother." I could almost hear him smiling. "Spencer's brand strategy firm was paid $280,000 last year for a digital rebranding and outreach campaign." That's when Eva's intel, which she had sent me an hour earlier, clicked into place. "Let me guess," I said, my voice tight. The campaign consisted of a website built on a cheap Wix template and a few TikTok videos of him drinking champagne at gallery openings. "You got it," David confirmed. "It's blatant textbook embezzlement, Oprah. They've been using the endowment as their personal slush fund for years." "We have them," I breathed, a fragile spark of hope igniting in the darkness of my grandfather's guest room. "We finally have them." I was a fool. I had learned the hard way in the military that you never ever underestimate a ruthless enemy. And I had forgotten just how ruthless my father could be. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Spencer, his voice a high-pitched, panicked squeak. "Oprah, have you seen the Philly Torch?" My blood ran cold. The Philly Torch was a local tabloid known for its sensational headlines and morally bankrupt reporting. I pulled up the website on my laptop, my stomach clenching into a tight, painful knot. The headline screamed at me in bold black letters that seemed to leap off the screen. "Hero or Hellraiser? The unstable past of the Crane heiress trying to topple her family." Below it was a picture of me in my army dress uniform, smiling on graduation day at West Point, juxtaposed with a grainy, long-lens photo of me shouting orders during a training exercise. My hands started to shake. I clicked on the article. Citing sources close to the family, the story twisted a harrowing sealed incident from my time in command. A difficult tactical decision I had made under fire, a choice that had saved the lives of my entire platoon at the cost of 2 military vehicles, was repainted as the reckless, impulsive action of an officer suffering from undiagnosed PTSD. They used phrases like erratic behavior and emotional instability. They weren't attacking the facts of my case against the endowment. They were attacking me, my mind, my service, my honor, the very things I had bled for. This was my father's work. It had his signature all over it, brutally efficient, surgically cruel, and completely devoid of any moral boundary. He couldn't fight me on the truth, so he was trying to destroy the person telling it. The blow landed exactly as he intended. Within an hour, the calls started. The first was from a retired art professor on the endowment's board, his voice thick with a new, cautious doubt. "Oprah, I saw this article. Perhaps we should postpone any drastic actions." Then a call from one of my grandfather's oldest friends, a fellow craftsman. "Are you all right, kid? This stuff they're writing, is any of it true?" The seeds of doubt had been sown. For a long, terrifying moment, I felt the ground crumble beneath me. I felt utterly and completely alone. That evening, I couldn't bear the confines of the small house. I went to the one place I knew I could think, my grandfather's workshop. I sat on a simple wooden stool, the familiar scents of pine, cedar, and linseed oil wrapping around me like a protective blanket. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. My righteous anger had been replaced by a hollow, aching void. My eyes fell on my grandfather's old, leather-bound Bible, sitting on the edge of his workbench, right next to a set of his favorite chisels. Its cover was worn smooth by his hands. I picked it up. It fell open to a page in Proverbs, a passage he had underlined in pencil years ago. I ran my finger over the words, reading them aloud in the quiet workshop. "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as a lion." The words settled in my soul. The fear, the doubt, the hollow ache, they all began to recede, replaced by something hard and clear. A cold, righteous fury. My father thought he could break me. He thought he could use my past, my service, my scars as a weapon to silence me. He was wrong. Perhaps you, listening to this, know what that feels like. The feeling of having your own story, your own pain, twisted and used against you by the very people who should have protected you. At that moment, I knew I wasn't just fighting for an endowment anymore. My father hadn't broken me. He had just handed me a new weapon. He had given me another reason to fight, and another war to win. This was no longer just for my grandfather's legacy. It was for my own honor, and for the honor of every soldier who has ever been told that their scars made them weak. The bold defiance I'd felt in the workshop began to curdle into a tense anxiety over the next 24 hours. My father's media assault was just the opening salvo. I was waiting for the main attack. It came, as usual, in the form of a phone call from David Chen. His voice was tight as a drumhead. "Oprah, it's worse," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "It's much worse." "What did you find, Dave?" "It's what I didn't find at first. It's a recent amendment to the endowment's bylaws, buried in 40 pages of legal jargon. My God, your father is brilliant in the most evil way possible." He took a breath. He's installed a poison pill. The term was familiar from my business ethics class at West Point, a defensive strategy used by corporations to fend off takeovers. Explain, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. It's a kill switch, Oprah. The clause states that in the event of a failed hostile takeover attempt, which is how he'll legally define your challenge, the endowment's entire asset portfolio is to be immediately liquidated. Every stock, every bond, every piece of property. I felt the blood drain from my face. Liquidated and sent where? That's the beauty of it, David said, his voice dripping with cynical admiration. The funds are to be transferred, in their entirety, to a single beneficiary organization, the Keystone Foundation for Civic Arts. Eva's intel flashed in my mind. She'd flagged that name. Keystone is run by his business partner, I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. Jonathan Black. Exactly, David confirmed. Your father has rigged the game. He isn't just planning to win. He's ensuring that if he can't have the endowment, no one can. He'd rather burn it to the ground and hand the ashes to a friend than let you save it. The room started to feel small, the walls closing in. The weight of it was crushing. Failure was no longer just a personal defeat. It was the absolute, irreversible annihilation of my grandfather's entire legacy. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on my chest. I was completely, utterly checkmated. While I was still reeling from the news, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Hello? Oprah? It's me, Spencer. His voice was unrecognizable. The usual smooth, arrogant cadence was gone, replaced by a raw, trembling tremor. It was laced with a bitterness so profound it was almost a sob. They're throwing me under the bus, he choked out, the words tumbling over each other in a panicked rush. Dad told the board that all the questionable expenses were my fault. He called it youthful inexperience and overzealous ambition. Mom just sat there and said she had her concerns and had warned me. I could hear a wet, gulping sound on the other end of the line. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't hear the entitled brat I had grown up with. I heard the naked, desperate pain of a child who had just discovered that the love he thought he had was entirely conditional. They never saw me as the heir, Oprah, he said, his voice cracking completely. I was just a marketing tool, a flashy accessory. The second I became a liability, they cut me loose. They're going to sacrifice me to save themselves. The ugly truth of it had finally broken him. A part of me, the hardened soldier, felt nothing but contempt. But another deeper part felt a flicker of something else. A grim, tragic pity. He was my brother, and he had been devoured by the same machine I was trying to fight. I have something, Spencer said, his voice shifting, the pain hardening into a new, venomous hatred. I have proof. My grip on the phone tightened. What proof? An email chain from Dad's personal account to mine. He gave me explicit, step-by-step instructions on how to use the endowment's credit card to pay for our family ski trip to Aspen, how to log it as strategic partnership development with a mountain resort. He was talking faster now, fueled by the rage of the betrayed. He did the same for his birthday party at the Union League. It's all there, Oprah. The dates, the amounts, the instructions. It's undeniable. There it was, the silver bullet. The one piece of evidence that could blow their entire defense out of the water, proving their direct, malicious intent. But it was coming from him. Spencer, the co-conspirator. The entitled, shallow fool I had never once respected. To use it, I would have to trust him. I would have to align myself, even temporarily, with the very corruption I was fighting against. It went against every principle of the honor code that was etched into my soul. But then another piece of my training surfaced from a different, more brutal classroom. A survival instructor at Fort Bragg, teaching us how to escape and evade in hostile territory. His voice was a low growl in my memory. Improvise, adapt, overcome. You use the tools the enemy gives you. The choice was impossible, and yet it was the only one I had. Send it to David, I said, my voice flat and cold, devoid of all emotion. Everything you have. I paused, and don't contact me again. I ended the call before he could reply. I had made my decision. I would adapt. I would use the weapon my enemy had placed in my hand. I would win. The cost was something I would have to figure out later. The moral haze of the previous day had burned away, leaving behind the hard, clear light of purpose. There was no more hesitation. There was only the mission. My small apartment, which had felt like a refuge, was now a war room. That night, I convened a secure video conference with David and Eva. My laptop screen was a mosaic of faces, financial charts, and headshots of the endowment's board members. A photo of my old Army unit was pinned to the wall beside my desk. The faded image of my comrades, a silent reminder of what true loyalty looked like. I remembered our motto, the motto of the Army Rangers, sua sponte, of their own accord. It was time to take the initiative. This is no longer a vote of no confidence, I began, my voice crisp and authoritative. The shift in my own demeanor was palpable. I wasn't the wounded daughter anymore. I was the commanding officer. This is a campaign. We have two primary objectives. Objective 1, neutralize the poison pill. Objective 2, complete removal of the Crane leadership from the board. David, looking tired but energized, nodded from his office in Washington, D.C. I'm on the legal front. I'm drafting a motion that frames our challenge not as a hostile takeover, which triggers the poison pill, but as a fiduciary protective action. The bylaws allow for emergency intervention by a direct descendant if the board is proven to be acting against the endowment's core mission. We'll argue we aren't trying to take it over, we're trying to save it from the people destroying it. Eva, her expression as serious as ever, chimed in from her home in North Carolina. Intel front is covered. I've compiled all the evidence, the fake invoices, the no-bid contracts, the financial statements, into a single, comprehensive intel package. And I've embedded the crown jewel, the complete email chain from Spencer. Good, I said. We have the ammunition. Now we need the soldiers. That was the hardest part. The smear campaign had worked. Several of the board members who had initially supported me were now wavering, spooked by the attack, on my reputation. An email wouldn't be enough. This required face-to-face engagement. Over the next 2 days, I met with them, one by one, on their own turf. I had coffee with Maria Flores, a respected community leader, at a bustling cafe in South Philly, the aroma of strong espresso hanging in the air. I visited the dusty, turpentine-scented Kensington studio of Arthur Finch, an elderly sculptor whose work my grandfather had championed for decades. I didn't lead with the spreadsheets and bank statements. I started with the story. Arthur, I said, sitting on a stool surrounded by his powerful abstract metalworks. Do you know what they called my grandfather at that gala? A rustic origin. They put a sign on his table like he was a piece of antique furniture. I showed them the article from the Philly Torch on my phone. I let them see the ugly headlines, the twisted words, and then I told them about the poison pill. This isn't just about corruption anymore. I explained to each of them, my voice low and earnest. This is about their scorched earth policy. They are willing to burn my grandfather's entire legacy to the ground out of pure spite if they don't get their way. This has stopped being a Crane family affair. This is a fight for the very soul of the endowment you've sworn to protect. I watched their faces as I spoke. I saw the doubt in their eyes soften, then harden into a familiar cold anger. I saw their sense of duty reignite. They were artists, activists, and teachers. They understood the difference between value and price. By the end of the second day, I had my votes. That night, we held our final briefing. The plan is set, I said, outlining the sequence of events. D-Day will be the quarterly board meeting 3 days from now. I laid out the phases. Phase 1. David, you will open the proceedings. You'll officially invoke the Fiduciary Protective Action Clause and establish the legal grounds for a no-confidence hearing, shutting down any attempt to dismiss us. Phase 2, that's my entrance. I will present the intel package. We start small with the questionable expenses, the pattern of mismanagement. Then we escalate. We end with the final charge, the shock and awe of Spencer's emails, proving direct, fraudulent intent from my father himself. Phase 3, I concluded, is the vote. The screen was silent for a moment as they both processed the finality of it. This was it. Everything rested on a single, perfectly executed operation. Before we ended the call, Eva's steady gaze met mine through the screen. Are you ready for this, Oprah? I turned and looked out my window. Across the river, the lights of Center City twinkled. I could just make out the top of the skyscraper that housed the endowment's offices, the place where they thought they were safe, untouchable. I was made for this, I replied, and it was the truest thing I had ever said. The battle of my life was about to begin, and for the first time, I was marching toward it of my own accord. D-Day. I arrived at the downtown skyscraper 15 minutes early. The conference room was on the 40th floor, a glass and steel box with a panoramic view of Philadelphia. It was a room designed to make people feel small. Today, it would be their stage for the same purpose. I was wearing a charcoal gray suit, tailored with military precision. It was my armor. I walked past the chairs, arranged along the walls for guests and observers. Without breaking stride, I went directly to the long, polished mahogany table and sat down in the high-backed leather chair at its head. The chairman's seat, my father's seat. A few minutes later, my parents swept in, accompanied by my brother Spencer, who looked pale and nervous. They stopped short when they saw me. My mother's perfectly made-up face tightened with fury. "Oprah, what is the meaning of this?" My father, Harrison, growled, his voice a low threat. "This is a closed board meeting. Get out of that chair." I didn't answer. I simply looked at him, my expression unreadable. As I held his gaze, a lifetime of intimidation and dismissal evaporated. I was no longer afraid of him. Right on cue, the door opened again. David Chen entered, carrying a stack of thick black binders. Behind him, walking with a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room, was my grandfather Silas. He met my eyes, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and took the empty seat to my right. David began placing a binder in front of each board member as they filed in. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste. "Good morning," David said once everyone was seated, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the strained silence. "Pursuant to Article 4B, Section 3 of the Endowment's bylaws, this quarterly meeting, at the formal request of a direct descendant of the founder, and with the signed support of 1/3 of the charter members, is now officially a no-confidence hearing regarding the current leadership. The room went completely still. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. The battle had begun. "This is outrageous," Genevieve sputtered, finding her voice first. "This is a childish rebellion, orchestrated by a disturbed and ungrateful daughter." Harrison pointed a finger at my grandfather. "And you let her do this? She is breaking the very promise you made to us." He was playing his first card, the covenant. David didn't flinch. "The covenant you refer to, Mr. Crane, was an agreement to cover medical expenses. It was not, however, a license for gross negligence and embezzlement." The word embezzlement hung in the air like a toxin, and then I took command. "If everyone could please direct your attention to the screen," I said, my voice steady. I clicked the remote in my hand. The large monitor at the end of the room lit up. I didn't start with the knockout punch. I started with 1,000 cuts. One by one, the slides appeared. A bank statement showing a $50,000 curation fee paid to a shell corporation owned by my mother. An invoice for a non-existent art exhibit. A no-bid contract for roof repairs on an endowment property, awarded to my father's golf partner for an astronomical sum. With each slide, I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift from surprise to confusion to a cold, simmering anger. My parents tried to object, to dismiss it as creative accounting, a standard operating procedure. Their voices grew louder, more frantic, but the evidence was relentless. I saved the silver bullet for last. "And finally," I said, my voice dropping slightly, drawing every eye in the room, "the question of direct, fraudulent intent." I clicked the remote one last time. An email appeared on the screen, projected for all to see. The sender, Harrison Crane. The recipient, Spencer Crane. The subject, Aspen Getaway. The text of the email was brutally clear. It was a step-by-step instruction from my father to my brother on how to charge their entire family ski vacation, including flights, hotel, and ski rentals, a sum totaling over $30,000, to the endowment's corporate account, and how to log the expense report as donor outreach and strategic partnership development. A collective gasp went through the room. Genevieve's face, a moment ago flushed with indignant rage, turned a pasty, ashen white. Spencer looked like he was going to be physically ill. My father, for the first time in his life, was utterly speechless. He was stripped bare, his arrogance and power gone, leaving only a common, greedy man in their place. The poison pill, he finally managed to rasp, his last desperate threat. "You force this vote, and the entire endowment is dissolved. It all goes away." David stepped forward calmly. "That clause, Mr. Crane, only applies to a hostile takeover. Our legal position, which is now supported by irrefutable evidence of a pattern of criminal fiduciary malfeasance, is that this is a legacy protection action as defined in the Charter." He looked my father directly in the eye. "We are prepared to file a civil suit against you and your wife personally for damages. Would you care to test your poison pill theory in a federal court?" That was the kill shot. The fight was over. The vote was a mere formality. One by one, the hands of the board members went up, unanimous. Genevieve, Harrison, and Spencer Crane were removed from the board of the Croft Endowment, effective immediately. Harrison stared in disbelief for a second, before his face contorted in pure, impotent rage. He slammed his fist on the mahogany table, the sound echoing through the silent room. He spat a single vile curse, then grabbed his stunned wife by the arm and stormed out, dragging Spencer in his wake. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I had expected. There was no elation, only a vast, quiet emptiness, and the profound sense of a great weight being lifted. A sense of order, finally, being restored. I turned and looked at my grandfather. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders weren't hunched with worry. They were relaxed. He reached over and placed his hand on mine, and in the silence of that boardroom, he smiled. The victory in the boardroom was not a loud, triumphant explosion. It was a quiet, seismic shift, and the aftershocks radiated outward immediately. The news broke like a dam bursting. Within hours, Barker Crane endowment scandal was trending nationwide on Twitter, right alongside Wow Art of Deception. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a scathing front-page exposé, detailing years of financial abuse. Major donors, the same people who had smiled and shaken my parents' hands at galas, issued public statements, swiftly and surgically severing their ties. The pristine, carefully curated image of the Crane family didn't just crack, it disintegrated into dust overnight. My phone became a relentless source of noise. Calls from journalists, emails from publishers offering book deals. An inquiry from a producer about life rights for a streaming series. I deleted them all. This wasn't a story to be sold or sensationalized. It was a house that needed to be cleaned, a wound that needed to be cauterized. A few days later, I sat alone in the endowment's main office, my father's old office. The scent of his expensive cologne was gone, replaced by the neutral smell of industrial carpet cleaner. It was so quiet. The constant thrumming energy of his ambition had vanished, leaving a strange, echoing silence in its wake. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of my own exhaustion. It was a bone-deep weariness that settled into my soul. The war was over, the enemy was vanquished, but the adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I had won, but I had also lost the only family I had ever known, even if it had never truly been mine. The final salvos from my family came not in a boardroom, but through my phone. My mother called first. The condescending, imperious tone was gone. In its place was a cloying, manipulative whine I knew all too well. It was the voice she used when she wanted something she knew she didn't deserve. "Oprah, how could you?" she began, her voice thick with manufactured tears. "You've destroyed us. You've destroyed the family name. You've destroyed yourself. After everything we gave you, you can't do this to your mother." I listened, and for the first time I felt no anger. Only a vast, bottomless sadness, a sadness for the woman on the other end of the line, a woman so trapped in her own narrative that she was incapable of seeing the wreckage she herself had caused. She would never understand. She couldn't. "Goodbye, Mom," I said softly, and I disconnected the call. My father didn't bother to call. His communication was, as always, brutally efficient. A single text message appeared on my screen an hour later. "You will regret this." It wasn't a threat, it was a curse, a declaration of a war that, in his mind, would never be over. Spencer sent a long, rambling email, a masterpiece of self-pity and blame-shifting. It was a pathetic, meandering account of how he was the true victim in all of this. I read them all. I let their final, toxic words wash over me one last time. Not to engage, not to argue, but to bear witness. To acknowledge the final crumbling pillars of a house I could no longer live in. It was time to close the doors, all of them. In my mind, I heard a prayer I remembered from a service at West Point, a prayer by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change." My family, I realized, was something I could not change. That night, I returned to my small apartment in Fishtown. I went to my closet and pulled out a small shoebox from the top shelf. Inside were a few items from my childhood, all gifts from my mother. A delicate silver bracelet she had given me for my 16th birthday. A heavy, glossy art book on Italian Renaissance painters. They weren't gifts of love, I understood that now. They were tools, instruments designed to shape me, to mold me into a daughter she could display. A reflection of her own refined tastes. I didn't smash them. I didn't burn them. That would have been an act of passion, and the passion was gone. I simply, quietly, placed them in a plastic grocery bag. I walked down the 2 flights of stairs, out the front door, and dropped the bag into the public trash can on the corner of my street. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of release. Back inside, I pulled out my phone. I scrolled to my mother's name and held my finger over the screen. Delete contact. I did the same for my father and for Spencer. It was a simple digital act, but it felt profoundly real. I was erasing them. Not from history, but from my future. Maybe you've had to do something similar. Maybe you've had to make that quiet, painful, and necessary choice. To build a wall to protect your own peace. It's a strange kind of grief, isn't it? To mourn someone who is still alive. It was time for the next line of that prayer. The courage to change the things I can. And the first thing I could change, the only thing I truly had control over, was my own life. The act of cutting my family out of my life created a vacuum, a vast, silent space. The war was over, but now came the infinitely harder task, building the peace. The reconstruction of the Croft Endowment was a more difficult and grueling campaign than the one I had waged to win it back. With David Chen and a new interim board of directors, the same community leaders and artists I had met with in coffee shops and studios, we began the painstaking work of sifting through the wreckage. We spent weeks in the endowment's office, poring over hundreds of rejected applications from the past decade. It was a heartbreaking archaeology of dismissed talent. We read desperate, handwritten letters from painters in rural Pennsylvania, saw photographs of brilliant sculptures from welders in forgotten industrial towns, and reviewed proposals for incredible public art projects that had been passed over. They were rejected not for lack of merit, but for lack of a compelling brand story, as my mother's notes often indicated. Each file was a stark, painful reminder of the soulless corporate rot we had excised. Then came the hardest part. We started making phone calls. I made the first one myself, my hand trembling slightly as I dialed the number of a ceramicist from Allentown, whose portfolio had been breathtaking. "Hello, may I speak to Maria Sanchez?" I asked, my voice quiet. A hesitant voice replied, "This is she." "Ms. Sanchez, my name is Oprah Crane. I'm calling from the Croft Endowment for Artisans." I took a breath. "I'm calling to apologize. We went through our past records and realized a terrible mistake was made. Your work is extraordinary, and your application should never have been rejected. We were wrong, and we would be deeply honored if you would allow us to reconsider it." There was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her quiet breathing. Then a single whispered word. "Why?" "Because," I said, "we're finally doing things the right way." That first call was followed by dozens more. Each one was a small, difficult act of rebuilding trust. Each apology, each admission of failure, was a new brick being laid in a new foundation, one built on honesty and respect. A year later, there was no black tie gala to celebrate the new Croft Endowment. There were no champagne flutes or self-congratulatory speeches. Instead, we gathered on a sunny Saturday afternoon in Fishtown. We stood inside a refurbished old brick warehouse, its vast interior now flooded with natural light from a dozen new skylights. The air was filled with the clean, sharp scent of fresh pine and sawdust. This was the new heart of the endowment. This was the Silas Croft Workshop. Instead of funding galas, we had used the endowment's capital to create a fully funded, shared workspace for emerging artists and craftspeople. It offered state-of-the-art tools they could never afford on their own: planers, lathes, kilns, welding equipment, along with a steady supply of materials, and most importantly, mentorship from established artisans. My grandfather was there. He was frailer now, leaning on a simple cane he had carved himself, but his eyes were bright. He walked slowly through the bustling space, running his gnarled hand over the smooth cast-iron bed of a new table saw. He watched a young woman carefully turning a piece of maple on a lathe, shavings flying from her chisel. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. I saw the unshed tears glistening in his eyes. I hadn't commissioned a bronze statue in his likeness or put his name in gold letters on a marble wall. I had given back to the world the very thing he had given me, the chance to create something true and beautiful with one's own two hands. That was his real monument. Silas Croft passed away peacefully in his sleep 1 year after the workshop opened. His memorial was not held in a grand church, but right there in the workshop he loved, surrounded by the scent of wood and the works in progress of a new generation. It was a small, intimate gathering of friends, family, and the young artists he had inspired. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't read from a prepared eulogy. I didn't talk about his life or his death. I just told a short story, my voice echoing softly in the high-ceilinged room. My grandfather taught me many things, I began, looking out at the small crowd. But he didn't teach me how to be a soldier. He taught me how to be a builder. He taught me about choosing the right material. He taught me about the importance of a solid foundation. He taught me that a straight, true cut is an act of honesty. And he taught me that the strongest joints are the ones that fit together perfectly, without force. I paused, looking over at the simple, beautiful pine casket his students had built for him. And the most important lesson he ever taught me was this: sometimes, to build something that will last, you first have to have the courage to tear a rotten structure down to its very foundation so you can start again and build it right. His legacy wasn't a name on an endowment. It wasn't in a bank account. It was here, in this room. It was in the skills he had passed down, in the quiet dignity of his work. It was in my hands and in the choices I would make for the rest of my life about what I, too, would choose to build. I didn't stay in Philadelphia. After the new board was firmly in place and the endowment was back on the course my grandfather had intended, I knew my work there was done. The city, with its glittering towers and its long shadows, held too many ghosts. So I left, quietly, without fanfare. I drove west, across the state, and settled in a small city in the heart of the Pennsylvania Rust Belt. It was a place of proud, stubborn brick, of old, silent factories, and of resilient people who understood the value of a hard day's work. It felt real. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been. With my own savings, the back pay and disability funds I had from my time in the Army, I rented an old, dusty two-bay auto garage on a quiet side street. I didn't launch a major foundation. I didn't seek out donors or issue press releases. I started a small, simple, nonprofit organization with a singular mission: to teach vocational skills and hands-on crafts to fellow veterans who, like me, were navigating the difficult, often lonely journey of reintegrating into the civilian world. They came, at first a trickle, then a steady stream. Men and women with scars, both seen and unseen. Soldiers carrying the weight of things they couldn't talk about, looking for a new mission. Here in the quiet of the workshop, they learned to work with their hands again. They learned to measure and cut wood, to weld metal, to turn rough raw materials into something useful, something beautiful, something whole. It was a place where the noise in their heads could finally be silenced by the focused whine of a table saw or the rhythmic rasp of a hand plane. I named the organization the Croft Bench. It wasn't just a name, it was a philosophy, a guiding principle. My grandfather's workbench was the center of his world. It was where he worked, yes, but it was also where he thought, where he rested, and where he taught. It was a place of creation and community, and so is ours. At the Croft Bench, there are no ranks, there are no resumes, no questions about what you did or saw over there. There are only hands at work, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the corner, and stories shared in low voices over the hum of machinery. It's a place where you can be broken and still be a builder. One afternoon, a young Marine sergeant, a kid who had lost his left leg to an IED in Fallujah, finished his first project. It was a simple, sturdy stool made of solid oak. He had struggled with it for weeks, his frustration at times so thick you could feel it in the air. But he never quit. He ran his hand over the top, which he had sanded to a glassy smoothness. He sat down on it, testing its strength. A slow, tentative smile spread across his face. He looked up at me, his eyes bright with a light I hadn't seen there before. "You know, Captain," he said, his voice quiet, "for the first time in 5 years, I feel like I made something instead of broke something." A lump formed in my throat, hot and tight. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, and I knew with an absolute certainty that resonated in the deepest part of my soul that I had finally found my home. The Crane family name, I'm sure, still appears in the society pages of Philadelphia. Their legacy continues to be etched onto the marble plaques of museum wings and university libraries, a hollow monument to wealth and influence. My legacy, the true legacy of Silas Croft, is far more modest. It's a living thing. It lives in the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. It lives in the focused silence of a welder concentrating on a perfect bead. It lives in the quiet pride on a soldier's face when they hold up something they created with their own 2 hands. It is not a legacy of stone and steel, but of skill and solace, passed from one pair of hands to the next. I didn't tear down my family's world for revenge. That was a victory that would have tasted like ashes. I tore down a false and rotten structure because it was the only way to build something honest in its place. And here, in the quiet peace of this dusty workshop, surrounded by the quiet hum of creation and the gentle camaraderie of my fellow builders, I finally understood. This was my victory. This was my peace. My grandfather's true legacy wasn't in what he owned, but in what he taught me, how to build something honest from the ground up. This journey has taught me that we all have the capacity to be builders in our own lives. It makes me wonder about the builders in your life. Who was the person that taught you not just a skill, but a value? What is the one thing, a relationship, a garden, a piece of art, that you are proud to have built? I would be honored to read your stories in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of stories about resilience and finding strength on your own terms, please consider subscribing and joining our community. We have many more to share.